old dog went down to the water at Aldermere every evening that the light allowed it. In every season and every weather, down the sheep-cropped slope behind the stables, past the leaning alders that gave the place its name, to the flat mossy stone at the edge of the mill race where the current ran fast and dark under a wheel that had not turned in 5 years. And there he sat, a heavy liver and white spaniel long past his best days, his muzzle gone the color of the frost that silvered the grass around him. And he watched the water go by, and he listened, the way a dog listens for a step it has heard 10,000 times and cannot quite believe it will not hear again. And when the light failed altogether, he rose, stiff in the hips, and climbed back up to the house alone. And no one at Aldermere Hall, from the housekeeper down to the youngest scullery girl, would have dreamed of calling him back before he was ready to come. For everyone in that house understood, without a word ever being said of it, exactly whom the dog was waiting for, and exactly why the man he waited for would never come down that slope again to whistle him home. The man's name had been Thomas, and he had been the younger brother of the Duke of Aldermere, and he had gone into the mill race one black February night 5 years before on a wager no more wicked than 100 wagers boys had made on that ice before him, walking out across the frozen head pool to prove he was not afraid of it, while his elder brother stood on the bank and laughed and dared him. Further, and the ice had given without warning, the way ice on moving water always gives without warning, all at once and not by inches. And Thomas had gone under still laughing, and had come up once, calling his brother's name, and the Duke of Aldermere, who could swim, who had swum that same pool 1,000 times as a boy, who was already running for the bank rope before his mind had finished understanding what his eyes had seen, opened his mouth to shout the word that would have told his brother which way the current ran, which way to fight toward, and no sound came. Not a word. Not a syllable. His throat had closed as though a hand had closed it, and he stood on the bank of the mill race with his mouth open and no voice in the whole of him. And by the time old Ives the groom came pounding down from the stables at the sound of the splash alone and got a rope out to the place where the current had carried him, there was no Thomas left to save. The Duke had not spoken a single word aloud from that night to this one, not at the funeral, where the rector had been obliged to conduct the whole service without once addressing a reply to him, not to the physician sent up from the county town, a dry, clever man who examined his throat and his tongue and found nothing wrong with either of them, and wrote. In a hand the Duke read over his shoulder without protest that this was a seizure of the voice brought on by profound shock, not unknown in cases of sudden violent grief, and that time, patience, and the avoidance of any attempt to force the matter were the only remedies medicine could offer. Not to his own grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, who had wept over him the first month and scolded him the second, and, by the third, had simply accepted, as a woman of 71 accepts most hard things in the end, that her grandson would say what he had to say on paper from now on, and had the household provisioned accordingly, a small ivory-bound notebook and a silver pencil case kept always in his coat. A second such set kept always upon the hall table in case the first should be forgotten. A manservant named Pruitt, whose particular duty it was to carry notes to whichever room required an answer, and a general understanding, unspoken but total, that one did not address a question to his grace that could not be answered with a shake or a nod of the head or a line of his own neat black writing. The county did what counties do with a silence they cannot explain. They filled it. Some said pride, that the young Duke had grown too great in his grief to trouble himself to speak to lesser men. Some said madness, and lowered their voices when his carriage passed, and were secretly a little thrilled by the word. Some, the kinder and the fewer, said only that a man who had stood on a river bank and failed to save his own brother with the one thing he had left to give him, might reasonably be excused for never trusting his voice again. And it was this last, kindest account that happened to be nearest the truth, though none of the 300 souls in the parish of Thorncombe below the moor could have told. You so with certainty, for the Duke himself had never confirmed it, could never confirm it. And the only living creature at Aldermere Hall who had heard the whole of it with his own ears, standing white-faced in the freezing dark at the edge of the mill race 5 years before, was old Ives. And old Ives had never told a soul, and did not intend to. It was into this house, on the last Thursday of November, that Miss Alice Norreys came up from the south with £11 a year promised her, and a small corded trunk holding the whole of what she owned in the world. She was 22, the only child, and now the only survivor of the Reverend Josiah Norreys, who had held the living of a poor parish called Ashdown Underhill for 30 years, on a stipend that had never once stretched to cover a curate, so that his daughter had grown up doing a curate's work without a curate's pay, reading to the sick, keeping the parish accounts, teaching the dame school 3 mornings a week for nothing at all beyond the good of it, and nursing her father through the long final illness that had, in the spring just past, left her alone in the world with a name nobody owed anything to and an education a good deal finer than her prospects. There had been no money. There had, in fact, been a small unpaid account with the Ashdown ironmonger that Alice had insisted on settling out of the sale of her father's books before she would let herself think of her own situation at all. And when that was done, there had been £11 and a very great deal of nothing. And a woman in that position, however well she could read Latin or keep a ledger, found the world had exactly 2 places for her: a governess's schoolroom, if some family could be found willing to take a rector's daughter with no letters of character beyond the parish itself, or a companion's chair, reading aloud and fetching shawls for some great lady too proud or too infirm to fetch her own. It was the second kind of place that found Alice first, through the parish's link to a firm of solicitors in the county town who acted, among a great deal else, for the Duke of Aldermere, a Mr. Pruitt's own cousin, as it happened, a Mr. Latch, who had heard from the Ashdown solicitor that the rector's orphaned daughter was a sensible, well-spoken young woman in want of a situation, and had written to say that Her Grace the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere, being now much troubled in her eyes and unable to read for herself of an evening, had need of a companion of good education and steady temper to read to her, keep her correspondence, and sit with her generally, that the wage was £14 by the year with board found, which was riches to Alice after 11, and that the situation was at Aldermere Hall, upon the high moor above the village of Thorncombe, a full day's journey and more from anywhere Alice had ever been in her life. She had written back within the hour that she would come, before she had time to be afraid of it, and had spent the intervening fortnight being told by every soul in Ashdown Underhill who had ever exchanged 2 words with a carrier or a drover from the north, exactly what manner of house she was going to. It was, by these accounts, the greatest house in that whole end of the county, and had been, within living memory, the happiest old men in the Ashdown taproom who had never been north of the county town themselves spoke with perfect confidence of the young Duke's grandfather, and of the young Duke himself as a boy who had grown up laughing in that great house with a brother 2 years his junior, the 2 of them thick as thieves, the whole parish's darlings, and then, always, the voices dropped, and the second half of the story came out: the drowned brother, the silent Duke, the notebook, and the pencil. And Alice had gone up on the mail coach and then the carrier's cart with her corded trunk and her father's own small writing case, the one thing of value she had kept back from the sale, and had watched the country change beneath her the whole cold length of that last day. From the soft green water meadows of home to a high bare country of dry stone walls climbing the fell sides like nets flung over the hills, bronze woods hanging bare in the folds of the land, and the light going early and hard, until, in the last failing gray of a November afternoon, the carrier pointed with his whip hand to a great pale shape crowning the moor ahead of them, long and gray and many-windowed, with lights already kindling yellow along its eastern front and the whole of its western half, so far as Alice could make out at that distance, dark, and said, not unkindly, "There she is, Miss Aldermere Hall, and God send you a warmer welcome than the last 3 companions her Grace has had," for none of the 3 stayed the winter out. Alice asked him, since he seemed a man who would know, whether it was true what they said of the Duke, and the carrier was quiet a moment. The way she was to find every soul in that country went quiet at the question, and then said only that she would see for herself soon enough, and that whatever else was said of his Grace of Aldermere, a harder working landlord or a fairer one, did not sit on the bench of that county, and that a man ought to be let keep his own grief in his own way, without every stranger from the south coming up to have an opinion of it. It was a gentle rebuke, gently meant, and Alice took it as such, and said no more, and watched instead, as the cart began the last long climb to the gatehouse, a single figure moving along the dusk blue slope below the western wing of the house, a heavy, graying dog, walking alone and unhurried toward a dark line of trees at the foot of the hill, where, though she could not have said how she knew it, some kind of water must run. The gatehouse lodge was lit, and an elderly lodge-keeper came out to open the gate and take note of the carrier's business, and beyond the gate the drive ran a good half-mile between avenues of ancient limes, bare now and black against a sky gone the color of a fading bruise, before it opened out onto a wide gravelled sweep, and the full front of the house stood up before her at last. 100 windows and more by Alice's hurried count, the whole eastern range warm with candlelight and firelight, kitchen smoke rising straight in the still cold air, and then, past the great arched door and the old square tower that rose a full story above the rest of the roofline, the western range fell dark, window after window shuttered or simply unlit. The old tower itself blind-faced and silent, and Alice, climbing down stiff and cold from the tail of the cart with her trunk and her writing case, found herself looking up at that darkness for a long moment before a manservant came down the steps to see to her boxes. And a broad, kind-faced woman in black bombazine with a great ring of keys at her waist came out after him, looking Alice over head to foot in the space of a single unhurried breath, and said, "Will you'll be the new companion? Come in out of the cold, child, before you catch your death. Her Grace has been asking for you since 4 o'clock, and I am Mrs. Tetlow, and you'll do exactly as I tell you in this house for the first month at least, and we shall get on famously," and swept her in through a side door into a hall so warm after the cart that Alice's eyes stung with it, and it was there, crossing the flagged passage behind Mrs. Tetlow with her cold hands wrapped in her cloak, that Alice first heard, from somewhere above and behind her, a single door open and shut without a single word passing through it, and felt, before she ever saw his face, the particular and total quiet of a house that had learned to live around a silence at its very heart. The Dowager Duchess of Aldermere received her new companion in a small sitting room hung with faded rose silk, a fire built up higher than the season strictly required, and received her, Alice was relieved to find, with a brisk, sharp-eyed kindness that had nothing frightening in it at all. She was a small, upright woman of 71, with white hair dressed high in the fashion of 30 years before, and eyes gone milky at the edges with the cataract that had cost her the greater part of her reading, and she looked Alice over exactly as Mrs. Tetlow had done, though with a good deal more open curiosity, and said, "Come nearer. Child, I can make out a shape but not a face at this distance any longer. It is the very devil." And when Alice had come and stood where she was bid, the dowager took her chin in two cool, dry fingers and turned her face gently to the firelight and studied it a long moment and said, "Well, you have an honest face, Miss Norreys, which is more than I can say for the last one, who read me Mrs. Radcliffe in a voice like a funeral and was forever glancing at the clock, and you will not do that, I think." Alice said she hoped not, and the dowager laughed, a short dry bark of a laugh, and bid her sit, and rang for tea, and talked for the better part of an hour, mostly of the house and its ways and hardly at all of herself, in the manner of the very old, who have generally made their peace with their own history and would rather hear the news. She told Alice that she read very poorly now without help, that she liked her a novel of an evening and her letters and the county paper of a morning, that she played piquet for pins and expected to be allowed to win at least every third game, that the household ran on Mrs. Tetlow's good sense and old Pruitt's discretion, and her own grandson's exact and generous management of every acre and every tenant on the estate, whatever else might be said against him. And then, seeing perhaps that Alice's eyes had gone, despite herself, toward the darkened windows visible through the tall glass behind the dowager's chair, she stopped and folded her hands and said, "You will have heard something of my grandson before ever you came north, I do not doubt it, for the whole county has had 5 years to make a story of him, and has made a very poor one, and I will tell you the truth of it once, so that you need not wonder, and then I shall not speak of it again unless you ask me. He has not spoken since his brother drowned, not from pride, and not, whatever the fools in Thorncombe may tell you, from madness, but because his voice left him at the one moment in his life he most needed it, and it has not yet found its way back, and the doctors say it may not, or it may all at once, and nobody living can tell you which. He writes a very clear hand, and a very civil one, and he will write to you exactly as he would speak to you, and if you are patient with it and do not treat him as though he were simple or fragile, which he is neither, you will find him, I think, easier company than his silence would lead you to expect. That is all I mean to say of it." Alice said, when she had found her voice, that she was very sorry, and that she would try to be neither impatient nor careful of him beyond what any person deserved. And the Dowager Duchess looked at her a moment with her clouded eyes and said, "That is exactly the right answer," and rang for the tea to be taken away, and set Alice to reading her the county paper before the fire, which Alice did, in the steady, unhurried voice her father had trained in her, reading the lessons aloud in a country church for 20 years. And the dowager listened with her eyes shut and her hands folded, and did not once ask her to hurry. The rules of the house, as Mrs. Tetlow laid them out for her that same first night over a supper of cold fowl and new bread in the housekeeper's own small parlor, were simple enough to state and, Alice would come to learn, considerably harder to keep without thinking. One did not address a direct question to his Grace in company, for it put him in the awkward case of having either to ignore a question, which looked like rudeness, or fetch out his notebook before an audience, which he plainly disliked to do. One answered any note he sent promptly, and did not make a great show of reading it twice as though it were a curiosity. One did not, under any circumstance whatsoever, attempt to finish a sentence for him, or supply him with a word, or otherwise behave as though his silence were a difficulty requiring the room's assistance to overcome. And one did not, above all, ask him what had happened at the mill race that February, a rule so thoroughly understood by every soul under that roof that Mrs. Tetlow delivered it almost as an afterthought, the way one might mention that the fourth stair from the top creaked and was best avoided at night. There was, besides Mrs. Tetlow and old Pruitt the valet, a cook named Mrs. Hanby, 2 housemaids, a kitchen girl, a groom named Old Ives, who had charge of the stables, and, Mrs. Tetlow said, of a great deal more besides that was not precisely his place, but that nobody had ever thought to take from him. And the dog, whom Mrs. Tetlow called Fen, short, she said, for Fenwater, which was the old country name for the mill race itself, though everybody at the hall simply called him the dog, or Old Fen, or, among the kitchen girls, poor old Fen, with a tenderness Alice found unexpectedly moving in girls not yet 20, who could have had no memory of the brother the dog still waited for. She asked, carefully, whether it was true that the dog went down to the water every evening, and Mrs. Tetlow said it was true, and had been true for 5 winters, and that his Grace himself had given strict orders, the very first spring after his brother's death, that the dog was never to be shut in nor called back, nor in any way prevented from going down to the race of an evening if that was where he chose to go, whatever the weather. And Mrs. Tetlow could not for the life of her say whether that order came from tenderness for the dog or from some harder, more private reckoning of the Duke's own, and had long since given up wondering, for wondering about the Duke's private reckonings, she said, with a small dry look that told Alice this was itself a kind of house rule, was a pastime that did nobody at Aldermere Hall any good at all. Alice did not see the Duke himself until the 3rd day. She was crossing the long gallery on the ground floor, a passage hung with dim old portraits that led from the dowager's rooms to the library where the county paper was kept, when a door at the far end opened and a man came through it and stopped, seeing her, with the particular stillness of a person unused any longer to meeting strangers in his own house. He was tall, taller than she had somehow pictured him, and lean in the way of a man who rode a great deal and ate little, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, though he could not, she judged, have been much past 30, and a long, grave, closed face that must once, she thought, before it had learned that particular stillness, have been a handsome and an open one. He wore black, as she understood he always did, a plain coat without a single ornament to it, and he carried, she saw, a small ivory-backed notebook in one hand with a silver pencil slotted through its spine, holding it as unconsciously as another man might hold a walking stick, a thing so entirely part of him now that he did not seem to notice its weight. He inclined his head to her, gravely, the small formal bow of a master acknowledging a servant he has not yet been introduced to, and Alice, remembering Mrs. Tetlow's rules, dropped a plain curtsy, and said only, "Good evening, Your Grace," without any question in it for him to have to answer, and made to pass on, and he might have let her. She thought afterward. Any other new companion in that house he might simply have let pass with the bow already given, and nothing more required of either of them, but instead he opened the notebook, wrote a few words in it, with the swift economy of a man long practiced in saying exactly enough and no more, tore the leaf free, and held it out to her. She took it, surprised, and read, in a clear, firm hand quite unlike the tremulous scrawl she had half expected of a man in his condition, "I hope my grandmother did not tire you with the whole history of the estate on your first evening. She generally does." Alice looked up at him and found his eyes on her, not unkindly, waiting, with an expression she could not at first place, and then understood, with something like a small shock, to be simple curiosity as to what she would say, The plain human curiosity of a man wondering whether a stranger would answer him honestly or merely agree, and she found she did not want to give him the second. She said, "She did rather, Your Grace, though I confess I found the piquet more alarming than the history. I am told I am to lose at least every third game." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, gone almost before she had marked it, and he took back the leaf she had returned to him, and wrote beneath his own line a single further sentence, and gave it to her again. "Lose the third game and win the fourth. She will forgive anything but being predictable." And then, with another small grave inclination of the head, he went on down the gallery and through the door at its far end, and Alice stood a moment where she was with the 2 lines of his neat black writing in her hand, and found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling, and that the house did not feel, in that particular instant, quite so silent as she had been given to understand it must always be. It became over the weeks that followed a settled thing between them, though neither of them could have named the day it settled. He did not send for her, nor she for him. It happened rather in the ordinary traffic of a great house, a note left with Pruitt to be carried to the small sitting room where Alice sat with the Dowager of an evening. A question about some book the Dowager had asked for that only Alice, who kept the library's small catalogue now, could answer. And Alice's reply carried back the same way. And somewhere in the second or third such exchange, the notes had stopped confining themselves strictly to their business, and had begun, in his hand first and then, greatly daring, in hers, to carry a line beyond it, a dry observation, a small question about her own reading. Once, memorably, a whole paragraph of his on the absurdity of a neighboring squire's new opinions on drainage that made Alice laugh aloud in the Dowager's sitting room, so that the old lady demanded to know the joke, and, on being told, said only, "Ha! He has not troubled to make Mrs. Tetlow laugh in 5 years. Mind you keep it up, child," and returned to her cards with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has long suspected a thing and has just had it confirmed. Alice told herself, in the honest hours before sleep when a woman in her situation could not afford to lie to herself for long, that she wrote back to him as she did, plainly, and sometimes teasingly, and never once merely obligingly, because it seemed to her a species of unkindness to answer a man's actual wit with a servant's careful nothing merely because he could not speak the wit aloud. Himself, his silence, she came to feel within that first fortnight, was a wound and not a wall, and the whole county's error, she thought, watching how the neighboring families who called still spoke past him to his grandmother or to Mrs. Tetlow as though he were a piece of furniture that happened to nod at the right moments, was entreating the wound as though it had also taken his understanding, his humor, and his right to be argued with. She did not think herself in the way of falling in love with a duke. She was a companion at 14 pounds a year, with a corded trunk and no family behind her. And she was not a fool, but she found she looked for Pruitt's step in the passage of an evening rather more than a rational woman managing a rational household would think necessary, and left it there, and did not examine it further. It was old Ives who told her, in the end, the whole of what had happened at the mill race, though she had not gone to him to ask it, having taken Mrs. Tetlow's rule about the subject entirely to heart. She had gone down to the stables one gray noon on an errand of the Dowager's, a message about a mare to be sent round for the vicar's wife, and had found the old groom sitting on an upturned bucket in the tack room, mending a bridle with the slow, patient hands of a man who had mended 1,000 bridles, and expected to mend 1,000 more, and old Finn asleep at his feet, with his gray muzzle on his paws, and Ives had looked up at her and said, without any preamble at all, "You're the one he writes his little jokes to." Alice, startled and a little ashamed of how much of the house evidently already knew it, said she did not know what he meant. And Ives had given a short huffing laugh, not unkindly, and said, "Pruitt talks to Mrs. Hanby and Mrs. Hanby talks to the whole kitchen. Miss, a thing like that does not stay a secret above a week in a house this size, and you needn't color up over it. It does the man good, and everyone under this roof is glad of it, whatever they may or may not say to your face." And then, setting down the bridle, and looking not at her, but at the sleeping dog, he had told her, in a slow, level voice with no self-pity in it and no relish either, the whole of the February night 5 years gone, the wager on the ice that had been no more than boy's foolishness 100 times repeated on that same pool without harm, the crack that came all at once, the way Thomas had gone under laughing and come up once calling his brother's name, and the Duke standing on the bank with the rope already half coiled in his hands and his mouth open to shout the one thing that might have told his brother which way to fight the current, and no sound coming, not then and not since. "I heard the splash from the stable yard," Ives said, "and I was down that slope faster than I have run in 40 years, and I came round the alders in time to see his Grace standing stock still at the very edge, with his mouth working like a landed fish, and nothing coming out of it. Nothing at all. And I have thought on it many a night since, miss, whether a shout from him would truly have saved the lad, for the current there runs cruel fast under the ice in February, and I am not certain any voice living could have turned Thomas Ashe from it once he was in, but his Grace does not think that, and never will, for a man does not reckon his own guilt by what a groom believes might or might not have answered. He reckons it by the plain fact that he had one thing to give his brother in that whole black minute, one thing only, and it would not come." Alice asked, very low, whether anyone had ever told him that reckoning, that a shout might not have served, and Ives shook his head and said that some things could not be told to a man, only lived down by him, in his own time and his own way, and that the kindest thing anybody at Aldermere had found to do in 5 years was to let the dog go down to the water of an evening and say nothing at all about it to the Duke, who, Ives was certain, though it had never once been spoken of between them, watched from the tower window most evenings to see the old dog come back safe up the hill, and counted, perhaps in that small nightly watching, some measure of the same penance the dog kept without ever knowing it was a penance at all. The letter that announced Mrs. Price and her daughter for the Christmas fortnight came the second week of December, and the Dowager Duchess read it, or rather had Alice read it to her, with an expression Alice could not quite place until Mrs. Tetlow, coming in with the tea things, caught sight of the Dowager's face and said, straight out, in the plain way of an old servant who has earned the right to say what she thinks, "Well, your Grace need not look so, Mrs. Price will come whether we wish it or not, she always has, being your own late sister's goddaughter, and never one to let a family connection go to waste," and the Dowager had said, with a dryness Alice was learning to recognize as her particular defense against a thing she did not care to feel too openly, that she supposed Honoria Price could hardly help being her mother's daughter, and that the girl herself was handsome and accomplished, and would no doubt behave beautifully throughout, which was, the Dowager added, precisely what worried her. Alice gathered, over the following days, piecing it together from Mrs. Tetlow's asides and the Dowager's own dry remarks, that Mrs. Price had made no secret these 2 years past of her conviction that a silent duke, however sad his case, was in particular need of a wife of strong character to manage what he could not himself speak to manage, and that her daughter Honoria, 25, dark-haired, and generally allowed the handsomest young woman in 3 counties, had been brought to Aldermere at every possible season since the old wound was barely a year healed. Always charming, always exquisitely dressed, always full of a bright, brisk, capable conversation that required no answer from the Duke at all beyond a nod, since Miss Price was, as she herself observed more than once with a little laugh, perfectly happy to do the talking for both of them. Alice met her on the day of her arrival, in the hall amid a great bustle of boxes and a small yapping lapdog Miss Price carried in against the cold, and found her at first look exactly as advertised, strikingly handsome, beautifully mannered, warm to Mrs. Tetlow and civil to the footman, and full of a pretty concern for the dowager's health that had the old lady, despite herself, softening visibly within the first quarter hour, and it was only when Miss Price's eye fell on Alice, standing a little apart in her plain gray wool with the dowager's shawl over her arm, and took in one swift, entirely unhurried assessment, the cut of her dress, and the absence of any name that could matter, and the exact nature of her place in that house, that something in the handsome face closed, very briefly and very completely, like a shutter dropped and raised again before the eye could quite be sure it had moved, and Miss Price said, in a voice of perfect sweetness, "And you must be the new companion. How nice for her Grace to have someone to read to her," and turned back to the dowager and did not look at Alice again for the rest of that first evening, though Alice, without at all wishing to, found she remembered the shudder a good deal longer than she remembered the sweetness. Miss Price did not, in the fortnight that followed, do anything a stranger looking on could have called unkind. That, Alice came to understand, was rather the whole art of it. She was charming at breakfast and charming at cards, and charming in the long, cold walks she proposed to the Duke each fine morning. Walks he could hardly refuse a guest of his grandmother's without a rudeness he was too well bred to offer, and she managed, with a lightness that never once looked like management, to be present at nearly every hour of the day in which Alice might otherwise have found some small ordinary business to bring her within reach of him, arranging to have the library's fire seen to herself so that she might be discovered there, curled becomingly over a book, exactly when the Duke came in of a morning asking Alice, always in the sweetest voice, and always in front of a third person who could not be permitted to see it as anything but kindness, whether she did not find it dull, poor thing, shut up with an old lady and her cards every evening while the rest of the house had its little gaieties, remarking once, to the dowager, in Alice's own hearing, how very useful it must be for a girl in Miss Norris's situation to have found so comfortable a place, for a rector's daughter with no fortune and no particular connections could not, surely, look to better herself very far beyond it, and one did so hope she understood her good fortune and did not let her head be turned by the kindness of her betters. The dowager, to her credit, said only, rather shortly, that Miss Norris's head appeared to her Grace's own two eyes to be very well fixed upon her shoulders. "Thank you, Honoria, and let us have no more of it." But Alice, sitting with her needlework and saying nothing at all, understood perfectly well what had been said to her, and by whom, and why, and found that the understanding cost her more than she had expected it to. She was careful, after that, to give Miss Price no smallest occasion for complaint. She kept to the dowager's rooms of an evening more strictly than before, answered the Duke's notes when they came, with rather less of herself in them than she had begun to allow, and told herself firmly, twice a day at least, that a companion at £14 a year had no business minding in the least whom a Duke walked with of a morning. The dog minded a good deal less what anyone thought proper. Fen had taken, in the weeks since Alice's coming, to following her about the house in the slow, patient way of an old animal who has decided, for reasons of his own that no human household rule can override, that a particular person is now to be trusted, he took to lying across the hearth in the dowager's sitting room while Alice read of an evening, his gray muzzle on his paws exactly as he lay it in the tack room. And he took, more remarkably still, to abandoning his solitary walk to the water on 2 or 3 evenings that December, when Alice happened to be walking in the shrubbery near dusk, coming instead to walk at her heel a little way before turning off, at the same place every time, down toward the alders, as though he had merely paused in his errand to see her safely a few yards on her own road first. Mrs. Tetlow remarked on it more than once, with a wondering shake of her head, that she had not seen the dog take to any creature under that roof, master or maid, in 5 winters the way he had taken to Miss Norrie's, and old Pruitt, a taciturn man not given to fancy, said once, handing Alice a note in the passage, that his Grace had remarked the very same thing to him, in writing, of course, and had seemed, Pruitt thought, though he would not swear to reading a silent man's feelings with any certainty, rather glad of it than otherwise. Miss Price remarked on it too. On the one evening the dog trotted past her own outstretched hand in the hall, tail low and ears back, to press his head instead against Alice's gray skirts, and said, with a small laugh that did not reach her eyes, "How extraordinary, Miss Norries! I believe that dog likes you better than he likes any of us. One would almost think you'd known him all his life." And there was something under the lightness of it, a small hard note Alice had not heard from her before, that stayed with her longer than she would have liked. The Duke himself, in those same weeks, wrote to her rather less often than before, and Alice told herself this was only prudence on both their parts, and did not let herself feel it as a loss until one gray afternoon in the 3rd week of December, when she came upon him quite alone in the long gallery, standing before the tall shuttered window at its western end, with his notebook shut in his hand and not open, looking at nothing that Alice could see. And he turned at her step and, after a moment's plain hesitation that she had not seen in him before, opened the notebook after all and wrote, and held the leaf out to her. "I find I have not asked you, in all these weeks, whether you are well used here, and whether the house answers your expectations of it. I find I should like to know." Alice, reading it, understood that this was not quite the question it appeared to be, and answered him as plainly as she had answered him from the first. "I am very well used, Your Grace. Better than I had any right to expect. I have only wondered, once or twice, whether I have made myself troublesome company to a house that had settled its own quiet before I came into it." He read that, and something crossed his face that was not quite the near smile of their first exchange, something graver and more searching, and he wrote for a longer time than usual before he gave her the leaf again. And what he had written was, "You have made the house less quiet, and I did not know until you came how much of the quiet I had mistaken for peace. I do not think I wish it back." Alice stood with that leaf in her cold hand a long moment in the gray light of the gallery, with the shuttered window at his back and the dog, who had followed her in, sitting between them on the bare boards, looking from one to the other with the patient attention of a creature accustomed to watching two people who could not, for their own separate reasons, quite say to each other what they meant. And she found she had no answer ready that would not say a great deal more than a companion at £14 a year had any business saying to a duke, and so she said nothing at all, and only inclined her head to him, and he inclined his to her, and it was, of every wordless exchange they had yet had, the one that left her heart beating hardest as she went back down the gallery to the dowager's rooms. It was 2 days after this that the small red morocco box went missing from the library shelf where it had stood, so far as anyone in the house could say, since long before Alice's coming, a plain worn traveling case of the kind a gentleman keeps his seals and small valuables in, known throughout the household, though never spoken of in the Duke's hearing. As Mr. Thomas's box, for it had been his, and had held, among lesser things, the gold signet ring he had been wearing the night he drowned, taken from his hand by old Ives himself before the coffin was closed, and kept ever since in that box on that shelf, untouched, as near as anyone could tell, by any living hand in 5 years. Mrs. Tetlow discovered the box gone on the Wednesday morning, dusting the shelf herself as she always did, being unwilling to trust so particular a duty to a housemaid, and the whole house was got quietly into an uproar over it within the hour. Quietly, because no one wished the Duke himself to hear of the loss before it could be found and set right again, without his ever needing to grieve over it. Twice, and it was Miss Price that same afternoon, who came upon the box, or said she had, tucked beneath a folded shawl in the small chest at the foot of Alice Norris's own narrow bed, and called Mrs. Tetlow to witness it with her own eyes before Alice had so much as returned from the dowager's rooms to learn what had been found in hers. Mrs. Tetlow, to her lasting credit, did not at once believe it, and said so, plainly, standing in the small cold servant's room with the red morocco box open in her own 2 hands, and Miss Price watching her, with an expression of gentle, sorrowful certainty that Alice, coming in a moment later at Mrs. Tetlow's send, would remember for a long time afterward as the most convincing performance she had ever seen given by anyone, on or off a stage. Alice looked at the box, and looked at the shawl it had lain beneath, a shawl she recognized at once as one Miss Price's own maid had been seen airing in that very passage not 2 days before, and said, as steadily as she could manage with her whole body gone cold, that she had never in her life touched that box, that she did not know it existed until this hour, and that she could not account for its being in her room unless someone had put it there. And Miss Price said, with a soft, wounded patience that was somehow worse than any open accusation could have been, that she quite understood how distressing this must be for Miss Norris, that she herself had no wish at all to think the worst, that perhaps it had been a moment's temptation only, a poor girl alone in the world with nothing of her own, surrounded daily by riches that were never to be hers, and that she was sure, if Miss Norris would only own to it quietly now, her Grace might be persuaded to overlook it and let the matter end with a quiet dismissal rather than the constable. And it was this, the sheer reasonable kindness of the false mercy being offered her, that told Alice, more surely than any hard word could have done, exactly how carefully and how long this moment had been prepared for. She said, and her voice did not shake though she had expected it to, that she had nothing to own to, and that she would answer for herself to her Grace the Dowager and to no one else in that house. And Mrs. Tetlow, closing the box with a snap and a look at Miss Price that Alice did not fully understand until much later, said only, "We will let her Grace decide what is to be done, and not before this evening, when the neighbors are gone home and the house is quiet. For I'll not have a scandal made in front of the whole of Thorncombe over a box that has stood on that shelf unopened 5 years, and might have been got into by any hand in this house that knew where to look. But the neighbors were not gone home before it came out after all. For Miss Price, whatever her private arrangements with Patience, had not reckoned on her own mother's tongue, and Mrs. Price, hearing the barest outline of the matter from her daughter in strictest confidence not an hour before the Christmas Eve supper the Dowager had been planning for a fortnight, could no more have kept it to herself through a full evening of county company than she could have stopped breathing, and by the time the last remove was cleared, and the little assembly of neighboring families sat over their wine in the great dining room, candlelit from end to end for the first time that whole dark season, the thing was known, in outline if not in full, to very nearly everyone at the table save the Dowager Duchess herself, who sat at its head entirely ignorant of the current running beneath her own supper until Mrs. Price, emboldened by wine and by what she plainly believed to be a simple charitable duty to see justice done, rose in her place and said, in a voice pitched to carry the whole length of the table, that she felt her Grace ought to know, before the evening went any further, that a certain article belonging to the late Mr. Thomas Ashe, an article of great and sacred sentiment to this family, had been discovered that very day hidden among the belongings of the young person engaged to read to her Grace of an evening, and that she, Mrs. Price, could not in conscience sit at table and see the matter smoothed over for the sake of good manners, when a thief sat among them, dressed as a companion. The silence that fell over that table was of a different order entirely from any silence Aldermere Hall had yet held in 5 years. It was the silence of 30 people at once, discovering they did not know where to look, and Alice, seated far down the table in the plain gray silk that was the best she owned, felt every eye in the room arrive upon her at once, and felt, too, though she did not look at him directly, the Duke's own gaze come to rest on her from the table's head with an expression she could not read and dared not try to. The Dowager Duchess, to her eternal honor, did not for one instant behave as though the matter were settled. She set down her glass with a hand that Alice, watching, saw was perfectly steady, and said, in a voice gone very cold and very clear, that she had not been informed that any such discovery had been made in her own house before this moment, that she would thank Mrs. Price to remember whose table she sat at and whose companion she had just accused before the whole county, without so much as a by your leave to the mistress of the house, and that the matter would be gone into properly, in private, and not settled by a speech over the port. But the words were out now, could not be unsaid, and Alice understood, watching the faces down the long candle-lit table, the quick sideways glances, the fans lifted to hide whispers already half-formed, that whatever the Dowager might rule in private that night or the next morning, the county itself had already tried her and found her guilty in the space of one held breath. For a penniless companion with no family to speak for her was exactly the sort of person the world was always most ready to believe the worst of, and no private ruling in a back parlor was going to unsay 30 mouths already carrying the story home in 30 separate carriages before midnight. It was Miss Price, into this silence, who turned toward the head of the table where the Duke sat, and said, with a soft, wondering, almost gentle cruelty that Alice would remember to the end of her days, "Well, Your Grace, you have not told us what you think of it all. But then," she added, with the smallest of pauses, the smallest of smiles, "I forget myself. Of course you cannot tell us anything at all, can you? However much you might wish to defend her, it must be a hard thing to have a person one is fond of accused before the whole county, and to have no voice in the world with which to speak a single word in her defense." It was said sweetly, sorrowfully, as though she pitied him for it, and it was, Alice understood even through her own white shock, the cruelest thing that had been said at that table all evening, crueler than the accusation itself, for it took the one wound in that house that everyone else had learned to walk around with such careful tenderness, and used it, deliberately, as a weapon, certain that whatever he felt, he could not answer it. He did not answer it. He sat very still at the head of his own table, with every eye upon him, and his hands flat and motionless on the white cloth, and Alice, looking at him now because there seemed no further reason not to, saw in his face not the blankness the county had learned to call pride, but something so plainly, nakedly wretched that she felt her own accusation forgotten for a moment in simple grief for him. And then he rose, without a word because there was no other way for him to rise, and left the table, and the whole company sat in a silence that no one, not even Mrs. Price, seemed to know how to break, until the Dowager Duchess, drawing herself up very straight in her chair, said that she believed the ladies would wish to withdraw, and the evening, in the manner of all such evenings after the single unforgivable thing has been said aloud, broke up within the half-hour, carriages called early, farewells exchanged with a brittle overbrightness that fooled no one. Alice went up to her small cold room that night and did not undress, but sat a long while on the edge of her narrow bed with her father's small writing case unopened on her knees, and thought, with the plain, hard clarity that comes sometimes only in the very worst hour of a bad night, that there was nothing to be gained by waiting to be formally dismissed in the morning. No proof she could bring against a box found in her own room by a witness of unimpeachable birth and manner. No family name to weigh against Mrs. Price's. And that the kindest thing she could do for the dowager who had been good to her, and for the man who could not speak for her without paying some price she could not yet guess at, was to be gone before the light, quietly, with her corded trunk, before anyone need trouble themselves further over a companion who had brought nothing to that house but trouble in the end. She began, with hands that were not quite steady however calm she told herself she was, to fold her few things into the trunk. And it was old Fenn, scratching low and insistent at her door somewhere past midnight, refusing to be sent off with a word as he had never once refused her before, who first told the sleeping house that something at Aldermere Hall was not as it should be that night. Mrs. Tetlow, whose room lay nearest the servant's stair, was the first to wake to the scratching and the low, unhappy whining that Fenn kept up at Alice's door, a sound so unlike the dog's usual quiet patience that she was out of her bed and along the passage in her nightgown and shawl before she was properly certain she was not dreaming it, and found Alice fully dressed in the cold dark, her corded trunk strapped and standing ready by the door, and a candle burnt down near to nothing on the little table beside a single folded note addressed, in Alice's own careful hand, to her Grace the Dowager Duchess. Mrs. Tetlow did not waste time on exclamations. She set her own candle down, took Alice by both cold hands, and said, plainly, that no young woman was walking out of Aldermere Hall alone on foot on a black December night with the ground like iron and snow threatening before morning, whatever she believed she owed this house or did not owe it, and that whatever Miss Price had contrived, and Mrs. Tetlow said the word contrived with a flat certainty that told Alice she was not alone in her suspicion, it was not to be answered by a girl freezing to death in a ditch before dawn to save the household the trouble of a scandal. Alice, past arguing, only said that she could not stay to be looked at by that whole county one more day as a thief, and it was in the midst of this, Mrs. Tetlow still holding her hands, and old Fenn turning in anxious circles at both their skirts, that a second sound came up the back stair. Old Pruitt, breathless and half-dressed himself, come to say that his Grace was not in his room, that his bed had not been slept in, that the side door by the gun-room stood open to the night, and that no one in the house could say how long he had been gone. It was old Ives, roused in his turn from the stable loft, who understood first where to look, and said so without needing to be asked twice. There was only one place in the whole of that dark country a man who could not sleep after a night like the one just past would go, and it was the one place, of every acre on that estate, that Ives had spent 5 years praying he would never again have cause to run toward in the dark. He had a lantern lit, and his coat on before Mrs. Tetlow had finished speaking, and Alice, disregarding entirely every rule of that house that had ever governed what a companion might or might not do, was down the back stair and out into the black cold at his heels before he had gone 20 yards, and neither of them wasted breath telling the other to go back. The ground was iron hard underfoot, and the moon, when it showed at all between driving cloud, gave just light enough to keep the path. Down past the dark stable yard, past the sleeping shapes of the sheep folded against the wall, down the long slope to the black line of the alders, and it was there, before ever they came within sight of the water. That old Fenn, who had outrun them both within the first 100 yards despite his years, began to bark. Not the low worried whine of the last hour, but a full, ringing, urgent cry such as no one in that house had heard from him in 5 winters of silent evening watches. A cry that carried clear across the frozen fields and brought a light springing up in an upper window of the hall behind them before Ives and Alice had covered half the distance to the trees. They found him at the flat, mossy stone at the water's edge, in his shirt sleeves, despite the killing cold, his coat flung down behind him on the bank as though he had not felt the cold at all, standing at the very lip of the mill race, with one hand gripping the old iron post that had stood there. Ives told her afterward, since long before either brother was born, and his whole body bent forward over the black rushing water in an attitude that stopped Alice's heart in her breast until she saw in the swinging light of Ives's lantern that he was not falling and had no thought of falling, but was simply standing where his brother had stood, or near enough to it, with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking in the silent, dreadful, tearless way of a man who has held 5 years of grief behind a locked door, and has just, in the space of one unbearable evening, had the door forced entirely off its hinges. Fenn reached him first, driving between his legs and against his shins with a whimpering insistence that would not be ignored. And the Duke's hand came down blindly to the dog's head, and it was that small, ordinary touch, Alice thought afterward, more than anything Ives or she herself did in the next minute, that seemed to steady him enough to lift his face at all when Ives called out his name across the last few yards. "His Grace, sir." "Are you hurt, sir?" And he was not hurt, and shook his head to say so. And then his eyes found Alice standing white-faced in her cloak, with her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind off the water, and he understood, in the same instant she understood it of him, exactly why each of them had come down to that black water in the middle of that particular night, and something in his face broke open in a way 5 years of notebooks and pencils had never once required of him. He tried to write to her even then. Alice saw his hand go, from old habit alone, to the breast of his shirt where the notebook was not. For he had come out into the night with nothing in his pockets at all, had not thought, in the state he had left the house in, to arm himself with the one tool that had stood between him and the whole speaking world for 5 years. And finding his hand empty, he stood a moment with it half raised and helpless, and Alice, watching him understand his own emptiness, said, as gently and as steadily as she could manage with her own teeth, all but chattering, "You do not need it, Your Grace. Not tonight, not with me. Whatever you have to say, you may take whatever time you need to say it, and I will wait the whole night through on this bank if I must, for I am not going anywhere else tonight that you have not first heard me say I am sorry to leave." And it was, in the end, neither her steadiness nor Ives's low, patient murmuring at his other side that broke the 5 years of silence, but the dog, Fenn, sensing perhaps in the way dogs sense such things before their masters do, that the moment balanced on some edge finer than either human standing there could measure, threw back his gray head and gave one long, carrying, mournful cry into the dark toward the water, the exact cry Ives told Alice long afterward, with tears standing frankly in his own old eyes, that he used to give at the end of every one of his lonely evening watches before he climbed back up the hill alone, and the Duke, hearing it, made a sound himself at last, low and cracked and terrible, scarcely human in the ruin 5 years of disuse had left in it, and the sound, when it came clear enough at last to carry a shape, was a single word, forced up out of him like something torn loose by main force: Thomas. He said it twice more before he could say anything else: Thomas, Thomas, as though the name itself had to be worn smooth again by repeating before any other word could follow it. And old Ives stood by with the lantern and let him say it as many times as he needed to, saying nothing himself, only steadying him by the arm when his knees seemed likely to give under the sheer strangeness of his own voice returning to him. And it was Alice at last, stepping close enough that the lantern light caught both their faces at once, who said his name back to him. Quietly, not his title, but the plain Christian name she had heard the Dowager use perhaps twice in all her weeks in that house, Gabriel. And it was that, more than anything else said or unsaid on that black bank, that seemed to bring him the rest of the way back into himself. He looked at her a long moment, with the ruin of 5 years of silence still rough in his throat, and said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper and breaking twice in as many words, "Do not go." And then, when she had not answered quickly enough for whatever fear was driving him, said it again, whole and low and entirely his own: "Please, Miss Norreys, do not leave this house tonight. Not like this. Not believing what they have made you believe of yourself." And Alice, who had walked out into a freezing December midnight, fully prepared never to hear this man's voice at all, found she could not have left that bank in that hour for any reckoning of pride or prudence the whole county might have brought against her. It was Ives, practical even in the middle of a wonder he would tell his own grandchildren of one day, who said that they had none of them any business standing about in the frost a minute longer, sir, miss, begging your pardon, but the egg does not care what a man has just found his voice to say, and walked them both back up the long slope to the house with the lantern swinging and old Fen trotting close at the Duke's heel the whole way, as though he too understood that his own long watch, at least for that one night, was finally and properly over. The house was awake and lit from end to end by the time they came in, Mrs. Tetlow at the door with blankets before Ives had so much as called out that all 3 of them were safe. And it was Mrs. Tetlow, seeing the Duke's face and hearing, disbelieving, the low broken thanks he gave her at the threshold, his first words spoken to that good woman in 5 years, who wept outright in the hall in a manner Alice would not have believed of her a week before. There was no question. After that night of Alice's dismissal being quietly arranged before breakfast, the whole household knew within the hour that his Grace had found his voice again at the very water where he had lost it, and knew, too, from Ives's own plain account given without embellishment to Mrs. Tetlow before the fire, exactly why he had gone down to that water in the first place. And there was not a servant under that roof who did not understand, without needing it explained to them twice, that whatever the truth of the vanished box, it would not now be settled by a whispered dismissal, designed to spare anybody's feelings but Alice Norreys's own. The truth of the box, when it came from an unlikely quarter. A young housemaid named Sarah, who had charge of the passage where Alice's room lay, and who had gone about that whole week. Mrs. Tetlow said afterward, looking like a girl with a stone on her chest, came to Mrs. Tetlow before breakfast, white and trembling, to say that she had seen Miss Price's own woman go into Miss Norreys's room on the Wednesday afternoon while Miss Norreys was above with her Grace, and had thought nothing of it at the time beyond a passing surprise, ladies' maids having errands of their own that a housemaid does not question, and had only understood what she had seen, and been too frightened of losing her place to speak of it, once the box was found and the whole house began to talk of thieves. Old Ives, sent for, confirmed that he too had seen the same woman crossing the stable yard that same Wednesday afternoon by the shortest way from the house to nowhere in particular, at an hour she had no natural business being out of doors at all. And it wanted. Once these two plain accounts were set together before the Dowager Duchess in her own small sitting room that morning, no very great effort of reasoning to see the whole shape of what had been done, and by whose contrivance, and for what unlovely purpose. It was the Duke himself, his voice still rough and low, and costing him a visible effort with every sentence, who chose to say it aloud, and chose to say it where it would do the most good, in the breakfast room, before Mrs. Price and her daughter had so much as finished their chocolate and their plans for an early departure that Alice suspected, rightly, had been hastened by a sudden reluctance to face the house again in daylight. He came in leaning a little on Ives's arm still, for the night's cold and the night's wonder together had left him weaker than he cared to show, and every soul at that table, footman and family alike, went entirely still at the sight of him. For word of what had happened at the mill race had run through Thorncombe on the milk cart before 6 that morning, and not one of them had yet heard him speak with their own ears. And he said, in a voice that cracked once on the first word and steadied after it with a visible act of will that Alice, watching, found more moving than any smooth eloquence could have been, that he understood a certain accusation had been laid against a member of his household 2 nights past, an accusation he now had good reason and good witness to believe was got up entirely by contrivance and not by any wrongdoing of Miss Norris's, that he would be obliged if Mrs. Price and her daughter would hear the whole of Sarah's account and old Ives's beside it before they made their farewells that morning, and that he did not think, when they had heard it, they would wish to prolong a visit that had already cost this house a good deal more than a Christmas Eve's comfort. Mrs. Price, to whom the sound of the Duke's own living voice addressing her directly seemed almost as great a shock as the accusation itself, went first red and then a mottled, unbecoming white, and began some protest about her daughter's honor that died somewhere in its first sentence, under the plain level weight of his gaze, and Miss Honoria Price, who had gambled a great deal on a silence she had believed permanent, sat through the whole of it with her handsome face perfectly composed and her eyes fixed on her plate, and said, when at last she was obliged to say something, only that she was sure she had been mistaken as to where the box had truly lain, and that she would not, of course, dream of remaining another hour where her presence was so plainly no longer wished for, and within 2 hours a carriage was called, and boxes carried down, and the 2 of them gone from Aldermere Hall by the noon, with considerably less ceremony than they had arrived with a fortnight before, and no one in that house, from the Dowager Duchess down to the youngest scullery girl, troubled themselves overmuch to make their leaving easy. His voice did not come back to him whole in a single night, whatever the milk cart gossip of Thorncombe chose to make of it in the retelling over the following weeks. It came back the way a limb long unused comes back to a man who has lain too still too long, in fits and starts, stronger of a morning than of a tired evening, catching sometimes on a word the way his throat had once caught on every word at once, so that Alice, sitting with him and the dowager of an evening in the small rose silk sitting room, where he now came to sit by right rather than by rare permission, learned to wait out his small silences without flinching from them, exactly as she had once answered his silences with silence of her own. Only now there was always, in time, a word at the end of the waiting, and then a sentence, and, within the fortnight, On one particular evening, when the dowager had gone up early complaining of the cold, and left the two of them alone over the chessboard, neither of them was troubling much to play. Something very near his old dry humor entire, so that Alice laughed aloud at a remark of his for the first time since that first evening in the gallery, and he watched her laugh with an expression that had nothing careful or wondering left in it at all. Only a plain, open, unguarded happiness that the whole county, had they seen it, would have found a good deal harder to explain away than 5 years of silence had ever been. He asked her properly on the last day of the year, and asked her, of all the places in that great house and that wide white moor, at the flat mossy stone by the mill race, in broad frosty daylight, with the whole vale glittering below them, and old Finn, who had taken to accompanying them both on that walk as a matter of settled habit now, rather than solitary vigil, sitting between their two sets of footprints in the snow, with his gray muzzle lifted to the cold bright air. He told her, in a voice grown steadier every day, though it still caught now and again on the harder words, that he had thought a great deal, in the 5 years just past, that this particular stone was the one place on his whole estate he could never again stand without his brother's name coming up in his throat, whether he willed it or no. And that he found, now, he did not any longer wish it otherwise, that he wanted, from now on, when he stood at this water, to think not only of the one voice he had failed to raise here, but of the second voice that had called him back from it. Hers on the coldest night of his life, when she had told him she would wait the whole night through on that bank, rather than leave him to it alone, and that he could think of no better use for a voice 5 years silent and newly mended than to ask her, plainly, without a notebook and without a single line of careful writing between them, whether she would consent to be his wife, and let the last 5 years of that particular stone's history be, from this day forward, the year he had got both his voice and his heart back within the same cold week. Alice, who had come prepared for almost anything from that walk except quite this, found she had no clever answer ready at all. Plain speech having been, from the very first, the one gift she had brought that house that no written note could quite match. And so she gave him only the truth, which was yes, and it was Finn, rising at once from the snow between them with his tail going as though he too had understood every word of it, who was the first living creature at Aldermere Hall to know that the vigil at the mill race, kept faithfully through 5 long winters for a whistle that was never coming, had finally been answered by something better than the thing it had waited for. The Dowager Duchess told of it that same evening over a hand of piquet she did not trouble to finish, set down her cards entirely, took Alice's face in both her hands exactly as she had done on that first frightened evening in November, and said, with tears standing frank and unashamed in her clouded old eyes, that she had known, the very hour Miss Norreys walked into that rose silk sitting room with an honest face and no fear of an old woman's temper, that the house had been sent exactly what it needed at exactly the hour it needed it, and that she would go to her own grave now perfectly content, having lived to see her grandson's voice and her grandson's heart restored to him within the same 12-month, and by the same plain, unlooked-for hand. The county, for its part, did what counties always do once the story is settled and safe to tell without risk of contradiction. It remembered, almost to a household, that it had always thought Mrs. Price a scheming, disagreeable woman, and her daughter a cold beauty, with no true heart in her, and told the tale of the housemaid's stone and the return voice at every dinner table from Thorncombe to the county town, with an relish that grew, as such tales do, a little in the telling each time, And if none of them could say with perfect honesty that they had thought so all along, not one of them troubled to correct the impression. And Alice, hearing the story come back to her, already half transformed into legend before the new year was a fortnight old, found she minded it a good deal less than she once would have. For a legend, after all, could not touch the plain and private truth of it, which belonged now to no one in that county but herself and the man beside her and one old gray dog who had earned, better than either of them, the right to lie by the hall fire of an evening instead of keeping watch alone in the cold. They were married in the small stone church at Thorncombe on a bright, hard morning in February, a full year to the week, though neither of them remarked on it aloud until the ceremony itself was safely over, since the night Thomas Ashe had gone into the mill race, and the Duke gave his responses in a voice that carried clear to the back pew, steady now in all but the very last word, which he had to say twice before it would come out whole. And no one in that packed little church thought the worse of him for the catching, for every soul in Thorncombe had heard by then, in one telling or another, exactly what that voice had cost him to win back. And there was not a dry eye among the tenantry when he took Alice's hand at the altar rail with a grip old Ives, watching from a back pew in his one good coat, said afterward he had not seen so sure since the boy was 10 years old. The Dowager Duchess sat in the family pew in her best gray silk, with her clouded eyes bright and her chin lifted, and declared afterward to anyone who would listen that she had outlived 3 kings' ministries and 1 entire fashion in bonnets, and had never in all her 71 years attended a wedding she enjoyed half so well. And Mrs. Tetlow wept without the smallest attempt at concealment through the whole of the register signing. And old Fenn, permitted by special and much discussed dispensation to attend the breakfast afterward, if not the church itself, lay the whole long afternoon across the hearth of the great hall, with his gray head on his paws and an air, Mrs. Hanby the cook swore afterward, of a dog thoroughly satisfied that his own long watch had ended exactly as it ought. The west front of Aldermere Hall was lit that night from end to end for the first time in 5 years. Every shutter thrown back, every window kindled, the old square tower itself burning gold from its narrow lancets for the first time since a February night half a decade before had put half that house into a darkness it had never wholly shaken off until now, and word went down the whole length of the vale below, from farm to farm and cottage to cottage, that the young Duke was married and the west wing was lit again, and more than one old shepherd, coming home late across the high fields that night, stopped to look up at that unaccustomed blaze of gold on the fell side and said, to no one in particular, that it did a man's heart good to see it, whatever the whys and wherefores of it might be. For a great house standing dark on a hill is a hard thing to live under the shadow of. However little cause a plain shepherd has to feel the cold of another man's grief, and up at the house itself, in the small rose silk sitting room, where it had all quietly begun, the Dowager Duchess sat late over her cards with her grandson and his new Duchess. In no great hurry to go up, content, she said, simply to sit a while longer in a house that had finally, after 5 long winters, remembered how to be warm all the way through, west wing and east alike, without a single dark window left in it to remind anyone of what it had once had to bear alone. Down in Thorncombe itself, the tenants kept their own celebration that same night, a bonfire built up on the green by the church, more for the joy of the thing than for any custom the village could properly name, and half the parish came out in the cold to stand about it, with mulled ale passed hand to hand, and toasted the young Duke and his Duchess so many times over that the blacksmith's boy afterward could not with any confidence say how many toasts there had been at all, and it was remarked upon, more than once around that fire, by old men who had known the two Ash brothers as boys running wild over that same green, that it was a fine thing to see the hall lit end to end again after so long a dark, and a finer thing still to think that the young woman who had lit it was a plain rector's daughter with no more fortune to her name than any girl standing warming her hands at that same bonfire. For it gave a body hope, one old shepherd said, working his own frozen fingers over the flames, that a great house's fortunes might yet be mended by exactly the sort of plain, overlooked, hard-working soul that a great house generally never thought to look twice at. And there were a good many nodding heads around that fire glad enough to drink to a notion so, comfortably flattering to themselves as well as to the new Duchess. Old Fenn lived 3 years more after that wedding night, long past what any groom in that stable would have wagered on him, and spent them, every one, exactly as a good dog ought to spend a well-earned retirement, asleep before whichever fire the family happened to be sitting by, underfoot on the stairs at the worst possible moments, and first at the door of the nursery, when a nursery came to be needed at Aldermere Hall, standing guard over a cradle with the same patient devotion he had once given a stretch of black water, until the day old Ives found him one frosty morning still and peaceful on the hearthrug, and told the young Duchess, who wept for him as honestly as she had wept for very little else in her life, that a dog who had kept one vigil faithfully for 5 hard winters and been given, at the end of it, 3 easy ones by the fire instead, had, on the whole, as fair a bargain as any creature could ask of this world. And they buried him, at the Duke's own particular wish, not among the kennel dogs, but under the alders by the mill race itself, where he had kept his long watch, so that the water he had listened to for so many lonely evenings might go on running past him still, though there was no longer any grief in the listening for anyone left to hear it. I have sat with this story a long while this week, turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see the damp underside of it, and the part of it that has stayed with me longest is not, in the end, the ring, nor the wicked, handsome woman who thought a silent man could never speak against her, nor even the wedding itself, fine as it was. It is the plain fact that a whole great house, and a whole wide county besides, spent 5 years mistaking a man's wound for his character, calling him proud when he was only grieving, calling him cold when he had in fact more feeling shut up behind that locked throat of his than most men manage to carry about loose in a lifetime of easy talking. And I think the lesson in it, if an old story like this one is allowed a lesson at all, is not really about dukes or drowned brothers or silent men in great cold houses, for very few of us will ever keep a house like that one, but about how very easy it is to decide, of someone near us who has gone quiet under a grief we cannot see the shape of, that the silence is the whole of the man, when 9 times in 10 it is only a door shut hard over a room he has not yet found the courage, or the company to open again, and I wonder, and I ask it gently, whether there is not some soul in your own life this evening who has gone quiet in just that way, who has not stopped feeling merely because he has stopped saying so, and whether a little of the plain, unfrightened company that a penniless rector's daughter once gave a duke who could not speak might not be the very thing that particular silence in your own house is waiting on. It costs nothing, after all, to sit with a person a while without demanding the words back from them before you have earned the right to hear them. It is what Alice Norreys did, without any plan to do it, from her very first evening at Aldermere, and it was enough, in the end, to call a 5-year silence back into a voice, and a voice into a whole house lit up window by window on a February night, and I think that is as fine a use of plain, patient kindness as I have ever had the honor of telling you about. So here is where I leave you both, on the last night of a hard year, with a great gray house burning gold from end to end for the first time in 5 winters, an old dog asleep by a fire he has earned, and a duke who has, at long last, more words in him than he quite knows what to do with, after so long a fast from speaking them. And if you have sat with me this whole long climb up the vale tonight, from a cold carrier's cart to a lit church on a February morning, I would be glad to know where in the wide world you were sitting while you listened. So put it in the comments below, the city or the county or the quiet corner of it you are watching from tonight, for I read every one of them. And it never fails to astonish me how far a story about one small mended silence can travel before it finds another house, another fireside, another person keeping their own quiet vigil, glad, in the end, simply to be told that the waiting does not have to last forever. Next time, if you will have me back, I mean to tell you of the summer after, when the old Dowager Duchess at last consented to have her eyes properly seen to by a surgeon up from London, and of the small particular argument she and her grandson's new duchess had over whether a companion who becomes a duchess is permitted to go on reading the county paper aloud of an evening exactly as she always had, or whether a duchess must, whatever her own wishes in the matter, learn to be read to instead, and I promise you it is a gentler quarrel than anything this house has had to bear in a great many years, and I think you will enjoy hearing which of those 2 remarkable women won it.